I'm really excited about this session today because we have Dr. Chris Hibner here, and he does a lot of things. We just had a little conversation for about 5 minutes about just a small chunk of some of the things he do. But a couple of the things I think are most interesting is that Chris has been an educator for how many years, Chris? For many years.
26.
26 years, and at all levels, and is now a superintendent of a school district here in Wisconsin. In addition to that, Chris has been a coach for a lot of years and has coached. I know basketball. Are there other
Basketball's been the
Yeah.
primarily one from
Yeah.
like youth up to like varsity levels, but softball, baseball, and then I helped out at the youth levels for soccer, but I helped out.
Yeah.
There was a lot of interesting drills
Yeah.
that looked like basketball drills. That's what I
Basketball drills with slightly smaller ball.
I just incorporated it.
So those things, and also a parent in sports with children who've been very active in sport at different levels. So Chris has just a really great perspective. But today's session, one of the things we've talked about over the weeks is the roles of coaches as leaders. But I really am excited today to kind of hone in on the role of coaches as teachers, and like in a very specific sense about actually the instruction, the instructional aspect of coaching. And I think one way to approach that is to actually talk more about teachers first. So we have teachers in the room. I came up as a teacher as well, as a high school teacher. Maria was a high school teacher. Were you a teacher at any point, Kevin? Well, Kevin, you're a teacher on the court now. You coaching and played in lots of things in different environments. So we've all had these different kinds of experience with teaching and coaching. But one of the things I wanted to start with, Chris, was just to ask you about as an administrator, one of your chief kind of things you do now, among many others, is to help make sure that you have great teaching going on in your district. And I know you have a great background in this, but maybe I'll start with a very broad question about what are some of the kind of things you think about when you think about excellent teaching or master teaching with the teachers in your district or teachers you work with?
That's as you guys know, because I consider all you teachers, absolutely. If you're coaching, you're teaching. And I think that's crucial. That's a huge question.
Yeah.
But one in which I would say, I think a master teacher, when we talk about master teachers and you go into a classroom, you see students engaged. And so you have to explore what does that mean to be engaged, because I think that's an automatic that's happening. And I think that's how you relate it over to coaching too. When you see a masterful coach, the players are engaged. But I think, what does engagement mean? Well, I think a lot of that is, a master teacher clearly and authentically has the kids understanding what it is that they need to learn and that they need to be able to do and perform. There's not this darkness about what are we trying to understand. It's clear. There's clarity in a classroom with a master teacher. And then from that clarity, I think all the excitement comes of the pedagogy. And that meaning, what I mean by that is a lot of strong planning, a lot of strong instructional leadership. But I really think at the core, when I think of that question, Pete, and for all of you guys, I think really the core of a quality teacher is a teacher who really understands the importance of assessments and somebody who's very assessment capable. And what I mean by that is, in the era in which I grew up, and to be honest, in the era when I was teaching, I thought I knew what a quality assessment capable learner was, and I thought that was about me, the teacher. I think that's shifted a lot through the years, and that is, it's not so much about the teacher being quality at assessing, but it's more about how am I helping the learner, the student in this case, whether it be a player or whether it be a student in the classroom, how am I helping them to be an assessment capable learner? So meaning, how am I helping them to develop the skills to identify what it is they know and can do really well, and what is it that they cannot do yet? And I think that word "not yet" is crucial in everything we do in learning. And when I say learning, I'm not talking a classroom. I'm talking an athletic field, a court, right? It's not yet. I think that's the biggest thing that we can incorporate into the minds of a player or a student, that you're just not there yet. And then how do I help you to get you there? So what we're trying to do is develop assessment capable learners. So when I think of the district that I'm leading, we really work on okay, so how do we help kids to know what they know and don't know yet? How do we help them to seek assistance, to seek assistance of fellow colleagues, fellow students, the staff members themselves? How do we help them to learn how to select tools and resources to help them with what they don't know yet? How do we help them to understand the skill of how do I monitor my own learning? Like, how do I monitor it? In the era in which I grew up, to be honest, my monitoring my learning was my teacher telling me whether or not I was learning, right? And it usually resulted in my grade book, right? Their grade book. And the grade book told me how well I was learning. Well, I think that's shifted a lot now. It's not about a grade, it's about learning. And I think that happens on a court and field too. And I think if those things can be incorporated, then it's no longer the coach or the teacher having to be responsible for directing it all to happen. Instead, you're empowering the student or the player to actually have life skills, to be able to be a learner long after that component of 9 months or a year or 4 years at an institution, or in our case, 14 years at a school district.
So I've got a 9th grade son who comes home from school, and he really doesn't care for history class. And I used to be a history teacher, so I got a little offended by that. I did a lot. Why? And he says, because it's stupid. It doesn't have any meaning. Like, why do I care about what happened? And so that kind of an example. Like, I feel like part of the challenge is maybe he's just a lazy kid, but maybe it's that there's lack of clarity about why are we doing this, about why should you care about what happened in the 1800s or that kind
Sure.
of thing. Does it, like, specifically, how does clarity look? What does clarity of expectations look like in a classroom? For example, a history classroom.
Okay, well, I would say to answer that, and I'm not trying to offend anybody who is working with your child, but I'm sure they're working hard, and I really believe teaching and coaching is a craft and a science. I tell community members that all the time, that it's not a prescribed method. There's a craft and a science to it. But to answer that, I think clarity is, in this case, I would say it's probably okay. So what are the exact learning targets that are needed for that history class, right? I mean, whether or not, most likely those learning targets are related to probably Wisconsin academic standards. So I won't get into all that, whether or not that's good or bad or indifferent, but it's probably related to that. So that's the clarity. Like, that is what's expected for your child, in this case, to really become proficient at. Now, that being said, you asked another thing, and that is about, but he's not interested in it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's where that empowerment comes in. He may never become fully interested and invested in history and those learning targets. But I'm going to have to show him, like, why these are essential. That he must understand these and be at a proficient level. But he has to know, I think that's the other big thing in regards to coaching and teaching, that we can't just work on telling kids what a learning target is, or a basketball player, or a soccer player, or a football player, about, this is what we want as an expectation. Kids, and I don't care if it's an adult or a child, they have to understand, what does that look like when you get it, when you finally understand it. What's it look like? I can't tell them what the expectation is, but not provide them some sort of evidence about what does that look like when you finally get it. Because if I don't do that, then what am I working toward? I don't even know. It's what's when I get it. What does it mean when I understand it? So I think when he gets that, then when you empower him, that's my point. When we really shift to empowerment, so it's not the teacher directing your son in regards to, hey, here's the test, here's the quiz, here's the assignment, here's the activity you're going to do. When the teacher's not the one always telling your child, here's how you're going to demonstrate that learning. When we can shift it to, your son has more of a voice in how he wants to represent that learning. Like, hey, I care about these learning targets. This is what I've got to work with you on. How you get there is going to be up to you a little bit. I'm going to help you, but you're going to have a lot larger voice in how do you want to represent that target? Do you want to do a project? Do you want to do a quiz? Do you want to do a test? To be quite frank, Pete, I think we've consumed way too long in education anyway, so we've always been giving, and I think we need to have kids start producing more. So it's not about consumption, it's about producing. Like, we need the kids to be more creative and critical thinkers and collaborators and communicators, skills that you see from effective teams all the time, to be quite honest, right? I mean, you might teach them, as we talk about basketball, right? you might teach them certain principles, and you might have some sets, but you need to react on a field and a court and a football field, right? You have to react to what's going on. I think you have to react in a classroom. You can't have a script. And so we're trying to change.
It's a very scripted field. I mean,
yes.
We all grew up with very very scripted.
But don't forget Madeline Hunter, right? As we know in the educational field, Madeline Hunter, I remember reading once that when she would always be reflecting upon education and the planning and the instruction, she would often go and watch John Wooden's basketball practices.
Huh.
Now, why was that? And she always said, because he was always assessing. He was always assessing and redesigning his plans. Seems pretty similar in the classroom.
Think of something like like in basketball, there's really kind of mundane things like footwork, like, how to pivot appropriately, or like where to set up in the low post makes a difference. Like 6 inches here or there makes a big difference. And to a 19-year-old kid, he's like, that why does that matter? It's like the history thing my son says, like, I don't care about that. Why does that matter? And I can't. So the learning target is we need to get you to post up 8 inches outside the block. But to that kid, I mean, is that the same thing? Is that the same thing as you need to learn learn about the causes of the Civil War?
I think you're right on that. But okay, so let's use that example as posting up. So a child may not be posting, a player may not be posting exactly where you want them, and 6 inches can make all the difference in the world, right? But to them, it doesn't make any difference. And I think that's okay from a standpoint, right? It's not okay from the coaching standpoint, like, I really need you to post up in this spot. This is creating havoc, and this is not allowing you to do the move that you could do crucially right because of 6 inches. But with that being said, I think what comes into that empowerment again is, have we taught a self-reflection skill? So meaning, has that player or has that student in history, do they have, through our process, do they now have the skill of self-reflection to go, why aren't you having success? Why is that more difficult right now? Let's think back to some of the things that we talked about, and let's go watch a video, or let's look back at some of your work that you're doing, and what's preventing you from being proficient at that skill or that learning target, right? Or that move. And I think if we can work with kids more on that self-reflection, right? I mean, to me, if you think about when I was in school, I didn't do much self-reflection.
Yeah.
I don't think I had the opportunity. I mean, the self-reflection was, here's your test back. Oh, all right, I got my B. Oh, I got my A. I won't say any lower than that, I can't. So I got that back. But, and maybe I might have a teacher, and this is no insult to teachers of my past because they work very diligently, but maybe I might have a teacher who would say, why don't you spend some more time working on that? But I wasn't really self-reflecting. I wasn't, and even when I did, it was about raising my grade. It wasn't about my learning or improving my playing, let's say, right? I think that's self-reflection. Now, when I think about back to my playing days, in my coaching days, and even my coaching now, I'm reflecting all the time, right? In my leadership as a superintendent, I am reflecting all the time on what's working and not working and why, and I'm finding evidence to that. And then I set goals from that. Why don't we have our students learning those skills, to be honest, in kindergarten? Those are skills that can be learned in kindergarten. And if you learn those skills in kindergarten, I think on self-reflection, that's the connection between one's current performance and one's potential. I really believe that.
Kevin, I'm going to put you on the spot here this thing we're talking about with like learning, like the details matter. Like when you're coaching, the positioning, the footwork, the timing of something, it matters. And again, it's not something that I think I grasped as a teenager or whatever. Do you see this come into play? And have you tried to figure out? Well, we can't get this kid to, again, let's say, to post up in a certain spot or whatever. Maybe we need to examine. Maybe we need to talk to him about, is there a better way we can get you to understand this reflection component?
I think all the time it comes up. I don't think I fully grasp it until, and you saw this firsthand too, the Bucks came.
Yeah.
And the Bucks were at training camp, and even beforehand, they sent in their assistant coach, their ops, their assistant general manager, and everything was down to, here's where we're going to park the bus. Here's where we want basket signs on the hoop. And you're sitting here going like, does this really matter? You're just coming in to play practice, and this is the first few days of your training camp. And then you see the operation come up firsthand. and everything is scripted. Every coach knows what basket they're going to, what player the basket's going to. It was all scripted down to a T, and that helps, I think, in two things. One, it removes confusion because there isn't,
The clarity we're talking about.
We talk about those in between times.
Yeah.
They don't waste those in between time. There's no wasted time at practice because they break and they know what hoop they're going to and they know what script they have and they know what players they're going to have. At the same time too, it provides that clarity of I know exactly what I'm going to be working on and here's why. And I think that it brings that greater purpose when you have details. And Coach Bud did a really great job of explaining like purpose and intention behind things. I'm not just going to tell you to move 6 inches and get frustrated. I'm going to tell you to move 6 inches here because this is going to open up a lane for this guy, or because the screen needs to be set. Whatever the reasoning is, I was a guard, so I didn't play that.
I don't know why you're supposed to.
We're all anyways nowadays. Yeah. But finding a way to bring that greater purpose into things and not just like you talk about giving that, like the word I was thinking of when you were explaining the whole thing is ownership. Having students be able to take ownership of things, and I think the greater reason for that is if they know why. If I know that me posting up 6 inches out or spacing the lane, whatever, here's why I need that for someone else or for me, whatever the reason is, and I take ownership in that, that's where you're going to see those details really come through. If you just tell me it and I don't do it and I never hear about it again, why does it matter? There is no greater reason why if the play works. But if you know that there's something greater, or whatever the case may be, and that's the thing, that's where you're really going to take ownership, I think.
So I have a slight different question, and I want to ask you about curriculum. So one thing I would hear about all the time, like in education circles, is like, a district is trying a new curriculum. Like we're gonna learn math in a new way. We're gonna learn literacy, and we're gonna try a different literacy program. There's a lot of conversations about curriculum. And there's I think there's a parallel conversation like in sport, like whether it's football. I was listening to an interview yesterday with Mike Leach, the guy from Washington State, and he's known for the air raid offense. This very distinctive way of coaching football, of offense. So I almost, there's lots of examples of that, of these different, and it's almost like a curriculum of coaching, like sets of plays, and often we think that will fix things. Like we have this new, what kind of teaching did you do? English. So like you're probably familiar with this kind of thing, different models of teaching English. How much does curriculum matter, and do you see those common, is that a legitimate comparison, curriculum? And like, I heard you say here a second ago, it's more about principles than it is about like a skill.
And I'll stick to that.
Yeah.
In our curriculum, we have learning targets, as we said, that's aligned. It's aligned to like standards that we're told, look, kids have to be proficient at these targets. But then we look at our curriculum as a whole and we say, so what resources can be provided that will help students with that learning?
So in the same way, because that's something, like when you said that, like you played for Coach Ryan, this famous coach, and a lot of people know him for this offense called the swing offense. But the reality is, and that's a good analogy. It's like a resource or a tool. He had a lot of principles that he held you to as well. Does that ring true to you, Q?
Yeah, he had his core principles, and if you didn't really follow him, I mean, he can give you the resources, of course, to show you like why we do follow those principles. But while you both were talking, I was thinking about learning and teaching and coaching all collaboratively. But I also think as coaches and teachers, we have to adjust to how our players or how our students learn. Some people learn by just talking, and some people learn by like visually, or you have to walk through it with them. So that's what Coach Ryan was good at, because everybody don't learn the same way. So if we didn't get it one way, he'll say, all right, we're gonna go to the clips. Or sometimes he would just say, all right, he'll explain something, he wouldn't even draw it on the board. So he would test it to see if we would get it right away or not. So
that's another thing we were talking about earlier, this idea of one of the biggest challenges to me as a new teacher, I remember as a fresh out of college, was differentiating instruction. You come into a classroom, I remember teaching my first classroom, I had kids who were way smarter than me in the class, and I had kids who probably struggled to read in the class, this class of 12th graders, and I got to teach all of them, and there's 30 of them, and that's the same thing the coaches face a lot, of this idea of how do you meet the needs of a diverse array of learners who are right in front of you.
I think that's the biggest challenge.
Differentiating
Yes,
and meeting the needs of
differentiating.
different-
But we've gotten to the point where we call that hyper differentiation, meaning I really think there's a big difference. And I didn't come to this conclusion yesterday. I mean, this is 26 years and with a lot of people who have helped guide me, right? And I am not speaking to the cameras or you guys saying this is the right way. This is the way in which we're evolving. But I think the hyper differentiation is what's considered to me the burnout of quality teachers, because they're trying to differentiate the 30 kids in the classroom, and there's just no possible way.
So hyper
You can get to
differentiation is
every-
you're getting too particular with every.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Like
Yeah.
you're trying to differentiate, but you're working so much harder. And I just heard a quote recently by George Curios, who I love. He has the book Innovator's Mindset and others, and he goes, "Who's working harder? If the teacher's working harder than the kids, there's something wrong in the classroom." And I think when it comes to differentiation, you're working harder. You're working a lot harder than the kids, and that's where we've talked about. So if we can really go to learner empowerment, not differentiate. The learner empowerment is about the kids. It's not about the teacher. The kids are actually we're helping them to learn the skills to how to learn. Not about content always. Content's important, but they're learning the skills on how to learn. And through that, we're empowering them. So they will start to figure out the ways in which when they know something and they don't know something, when they can ask for help, they can go seek the tools again, the resources, and it didn't take me necessarily identifying that for them. They become they have more ownership, they become more independent. To go Q's point, it's like a collective responsibility. And so we feel we can reach the kids more. And we also feel it's just plain good for kids, because now they're developing learning skills. They're not learning history, they're learning how to learn history through the learning process. And you can do that in every class.
And that's, you could make that argument then in sport. So like we always talk about that, the value of sport is not just learning how to kick a soccer ball or to shoot a basketball. You're learning something way deeper than that.
Yes.
Right. And I asked you this question, as you think about these things, you have this angle as an administrator working with a bunch of teachers. You also have this angle as the coach, but also someone who has been coached as a former athlete. Do you have any stories or examples of people either who coached you or who you have worked with in more recent years, of coaches who have been kind of master teachers and what that looked like?
To be frank, I can think of a lot of people, but actually, I think a person who impacted my coaching probably immensely. I mean, besides like my siblings and honestly my mother and father impacting me from a standpoint of just work ethic and character and all those things, which are vitally crucial to a quality educator and a quality coach in my mind, right? I mean, let's not forget all those. The pedagogy is great, but if you don't bring positive energy and an energizer, and if you're not a person whose character, all that's lost in my mind, all of it, right? But I think of my former boss when I was a principal, my former superintendent, and I'll tell you, she never once talked to me about coaching. Right? She never once talked to me
when you were a coach at the time? Or?
And I was a coach at the time. And she never once talked to me about coaching. But she made me reflect a lot upon my teaching and my leadership when I was principal, and in regards to some of the things that we've talked about here, which evolved to me changing my coaching. So when I first started out in coaching at a varsity level, I can tell you, I kind of controlled a lot. I controlled a lot. I controlled the station work, even though I thought, I'm differentiating, right? I got all this different station work, and I got the guards and forwards in that era, right? And now it's a lot totally different. But I mean, and we were working on all this different play and skill development, and that was all great. But I was controlling it a lot, and I wasn't empowering the players. I can tell you that. I wasn't empowering. I was the one doing all the differentiation. I was the one pointing out strengths and weaknesses, and I was the one probably even setting their goals rather than them setting their goals. I was setting it for them and just reviewing it with them. So I was doing all of those things, and through her dialogue and discussion with me about what a quality classroom is, on the things that we've kind of talked about. And at that time, it was more about differentiation and learner empowerment. That's evolved over time. But I would say she helped me to evolve to the point of going, why am I doing what I'm doing? And are they getting it? Do they understand? Like when you're ready to rip your hair out going, I've gone over this how many times and you're still not understanding the principles. And instead of falling back to lack of effort, lack of focus, you're not engaged with me. Well, how about asking yourself, why aren't they engaged with you? Why aren't they hearing you? Why don't they understand it? Some self-reflection, right? And she taught me that very quickly in regards to, where's your self-reflection? Where's your component of altering that? And one of the things I think over time that I've evolved in, and I did that in coaching, was at a certain point in time I said, wait a minute, my job is to create the conditions. Like, set the conditions. You can't even necessarily be responsible for motivating a kid, but you sure can set conditions that makes a player or a student feel more invested, inspired, and interested. You can set those conditions, and there's another quote I love about, and I can't remember who said it, when you have a flower, which I'm not very good at doing any of that, but when you have a flower, right, and it's not appropriately growing, you don't remove the flower. You nurture everything around the flower. You nurture it so it can grow and prosper. And so my whole point is, what as a coach do we do, or as an administrator, as a teacher, what conditions do we set in that classroom or that field or that court, what conditions do we set to allow our players and our students to prosper and grow? And that's our responsibility.
I think one of the great advantages we have in sport is that often, usually a kid shows up at your team because they have an interest, like they love it, like that's an initial thing.
Probably, right?
They find you because they want to do it, they find meaning in it, they're good at it. But then the flip side of that is one of the worst things to see is that we often almost beat that out of them, like that what we loved becomes a task, or what we love becomes something that is drudgery to us. And I as a young coach, was definitely guilty of that, of not valuing the beauty of what it is them coming. Like, there's a beauty in someone who loves to play soccer or someone who loves to play basketball, and they show up, and that's a beautiful thing to have 15 people together doing something they love and they're good at, and they can each become better together than they were on their own. But so many times that just doesn't happen. I think a lot of things you're saying today.
Can I build out there really
Yeah.
quick? So there's research out there, and Young Zhao has that research, and it kind of correlates, and that is, and I've stated this to our staff before, so when kids are in primary grades, especially in 5K in first grade, that over like 85% of those students, don't quote me on that, but it's fairly up there, 85% of those kids are like, they're considered high amounts of creativity. I'm not talking talented and gifted, I'm just talking, they're highly creative, like, right? They're so involved. And by the time they reach high school, that has plummeted. Yeah. Now, if we don't think we're responsible to a degree of that, we're wrong. I'm not saying we're solely responsible, but we are somewhat responsible when kids are losing their inspiration and their love and passion and their creativity. And by the way, I go on forever about the importance of creativity on entrepreneurship in regards to why we need it in our civilization. That's a huge disservice we're doing to the kids. And so I think about that when you say that with coaching, like, guilty as charged. When I was coaching, I probably got too focused moons ago, not any longer, I like to believe, but moons ago, I was more focused on a product than a process, right? And I understand the challenges. I mean, today, even as a superintendent, so I understand from the world of collegiate coaching to a degree, the pressures. Don't get me wrong, I get the pressure. I have those pressures a lot different, but as a superintendent, different pressures from an ACT and AP prep and even benchmarks at elementary level, right? And it kind of goes to what we talked about earlier. That's where I'll go with saying, look, those pressures are always going to be there, unfortunately, but you have to identify what you value. And I would do that with your players, or in my case, with my students' voice, and definitely my staff. We have to identify what we value and then assess that. Because I can tell you, there's plenty of other people outside of your world that will be assessing, will be valuing, will be telling you what should be valued. And they'll assess that, right? I mean, in school, we get assessed on a lot of standardized tests. So that's what the community sees, and they say, you're achieving or you're not achieving as a district. So I always tell people, like, look, that's already going to be assessed on us. We need to say what else we value, and we have to assess that and start sharing that story. And that's where I go to process, not as much product. Product, I think Bill Walsh said, right? Product will take care of itself. Be honest to your process.
Yeah. So we're about out of time, but the idea of a coach as a master teacher, I think, is one that is really worth our thinking about more deeply. I think these insights of someone who's a leader of teachers is a really profound one for us. And by the way, he walks the walk or walks the talk, because I've seen Coach at practice, or Chris, I call him Coach because he's a coach as well. And he builds, even into like practices, he builds in, do you call it dream time or something?
Yeah.
He builds that into his practices. So like
Dream time and creative time.
creative time where like 10 minutes every practice, he tells kids to go to their hoop and just try something different. Do
That they're not
something
going to be successful at.
that
Do
they'll
what you
fail
want to
at,
be
get
failing.
used
Do
to.
what you'll fail at.
And so
Be used to failing. It's okay.
that's a great
Permission.
example. So, well, this has been awesome. Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Pete.
Chris.
I
Awesome.
appreciate it.
Yeah, great.